This time I'll be speaking about issues related to conducting human subjects research with autistic participants. Again, my name is Christina Nicolaidis, and I'm a professor at Portland State University and Oregon Health and Science University, and the co-director of ASPIRE. So it seems like in the last few years, as the cohort of kids that were diagnosed with autism in the late 1990s and the early 2000s has reached transition age, everyone has suddenly started to notice that autistic children, grow up to be autistic adults. However, it's time for autism researchers to transition too. Up to now, the vast preponderance of autism research involving human subjects has been focused on children. And while autism researchers may have gained important skills for how to include autistic children in their studies, for example, by finding ways to help them tolerate being in MRI scans, the basic assumption has largely been that it's the children's presumably non-autistic parents and guardians who are responding to recruitment efforts, offering informed consent, filling out surveys, and so on. As autism researchers start conducting more autism research with older children, transitioning youth, and adults, there's a lot of things to consider that may not have been part of their training. And even though most of what I'm going to cover focuses on research with adolescents and adults, there may still be a few important lessons for researchers who primarily work with younger children too. There's far more to conducting human subjects research than I can possibly cover in this brief training, but I'll provide a high-level overview of some of the main issues related to informed consent, collecting qualitative and survey data directly from autistic participants, and the use of informant reporters. Please watch the Q&A videos for more detailed information on each of these topics. You can also see practical examples and templates on our ASPIRE website. Let's start with issues related to informed consent. No matter what type of research we do, we're all bound by the basic ethical principles of beneficence, doing and promoting good, autonomy, respecting people's rights to make choices for themselves, non-maleficence, not inflicting evil or harm, and justice, treating others equally and fairly. I'm sure all of us believe that our work meets the principle of beneficence. I mean, why would we even be here if we weren't trying to do good? But especially when doing research with potentially vulnerable populations, it may feel like there's a tension between the other three principles. It's always important to try to balance the need to avoid risk of undue influence and exploitation with the need to maximize autonomy, inclusion, and fairness. And while it may sometimes feel like the way to get a protocol through an IRB easily is to maximize the protection of vulnerable subjects, being overly protective and denying people autonomy or justice is also unethical. Autism researchers, especially those working with adults, have to consider difficult questions regarding who can or cannot provide informed consent. No matter what you may have learned, there isn't one simple set of rules. Don't assume that any adult with an autism diagnosis needs to undergo assessment of decisional capacity. You need to consider the study's level of risk, setting, population, and procedures. And based on those factors, you need to weigh the risk that a person with decisional impairment would accidentally offer consent and the harm that doing so could cause them versus the potential negative effects of such assessments on participant burden, respect, inclusion, and fairness, which may then influence the representativeness of your sample, the scientific rigor, and the benefits of the study. And of course, in cases where a participant cannot offer consent, seek consent from a legally authorized representative, but encourage supported decision-making and assent. I will offer an example from one of our NIH R01 funded projects to make some of these points more concrete. This is a prospective cohort study with remote data collection. It's a low-risk study, but we do collect protected health information, and we include a wide range of participants, including some who may have a decisional impairment. Still, we offer an online consent process that doesn't require paper signatures so as to minimize burden. And then we use slightly different processes depending on how participants get to the study. For autistic participants who are responding directly, there's no assessment of decisional impairment or questions about guardianship. But we do have a note on the consent form reminding participants to make the decision with their legal guardian if they have them. We feel that we can reasonably assume that if someone with a guardian is able to access our study on their own over the internet, then they probably already have strategies in place in real life for how to involve a legally authorized representative when needed. For those participating with help from a supporter, we do ask questions related to whether the participant usually makes these types of decisions on their own and about the types of support the supporter can provide. And then we use a branch pattern with instructions for how to support the participant and/or involve a legally authorized representative, depending on the answers. And here are some portions of our consent and authorization form. You'll notice that it really doesn't look anything like the consent form templates IRBs typically provide. It still has all the required elements, but in what we believe is a much more accessible format. You will notice that we use lots of pictures and icons in white space. We also reorganized all the content and put it in Q&A format in plain language. Our autistic team members, both with and without intellectual disability, made sure that the language is easy to understand and the information is complete. And yes, it's a little known secret, but you can change IRB templates, even the parts that say you aren't allowed to change them, as long as you offer a good argument. So let's move on to data collection. Qualitative data collection almost always relies on the use of open-ended questions. But anyone who knows anything about autism can tell you that some autistic people may have challenges with open-ended questions. We use several strategies to help make sure we have rich data collection. For example, we provide participants with an advanced look at materials, and we offer various modes of participation, including synchronous and asynchronous modes with both oral and text options. We start interviews with detailed instructions to help participants understand what is wanted. And then we work with our community partners to make sure that questions are concrete and that we provide a lot of specificity, even with open-ended questions. Ultimately, we try to get people to tell a good story. And we find it sometimes helps to first get some details early on that we can then use as anchors. Survey data collection is even trickier. Patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs, and other survey instruments are critically important in many types of autism research. However, there is marked overuse of proxy reporting. Like most of the literature on sexual knowledge, desires, and experiences of autistic teens and young adults comes from surveys of their parents. Really? How many of you think your own parents would have been able to answer accurately about your experiences, knowledge, or desires? And then validated, quote, direct report instruments may not be valid for use with autistic participants. In many cases, survey studies use self-report versions of instruments that were created for parents, and they might not translate well just by changing the pronouns from third person to second person. Or even more commonly, they use instruments that were created and tested in general populations. And sometimes they might not even be measuring the right constructs. Ultimately, I don't have to tell anyone that bad data leads to wrong conclusions and poor impact. Over the past 16 years, our community partners have reviewed lots of existing survey instruments. And unfortunately, they have found most existing instruments to be highly inaccessible. They often felt they would experience significant confusion, frustration, anxiety, or anger. And they stated that if they were taking a survey that used these instruments, they would offer unreliable answers, leave many items blank, or stop participating in the study. And everyone knows that bad data leads to wrong conclusions and poor impact. Over the years, we've noted several concerns that come up commonly across multiple instruments, including the use of difficult vocabulary, imprecise language or figures of speech, complex sentence structure, or double-barreled items, and response options with vague terms. Partners have also noted that some items could be capturing autistic traits that are not part of the intended construct, or that there isn't enough context to be able to answer. They had a particularly hard time when they felt that responses can vary in different situations or contexts. Finally, they felt that some instruments used highly offensive language or concepts. We've developed a collaborative process for making various adaptations. For example, we often create more detailed introductions or provide hot links for deeper or more nuanced explanations. We simplify sentence structure, and when possible, we substitute difficult vocabulary words or phrases with more straightforward terms. And when applicable, we add graphics to increase clarity of response options. On the left, you can see an example of our use of graphics to help with vague response options. As you can imagine, our autistic participants felt it was very hard to choose between things like a little of the time and some of the time. Some partners suggested adding percentages like 25 to 35 to 30% of the time, but other partners who had a harder time with math felt very intimidated by percentages. Ultimately, we added in cylinders filled to different levels so that, for example, someone can look at a little of the time and get the idea that it means about 25% of the time without listing actual percentages. On the right, you can see an example of how we handle the double-barreled item from the commonly used PHQ-9 to measure depression. Partners complained that they would have different answers to how often they were bothered by trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or sleeping too much. We didn't want to split the question into separate items as that would affect the scoring, but we were able to bring the concept up a level, asking about trouble with sleep, and then listing the components that were in the original items just as examples. Lastly, I want to say a word about informant reports. We try to enable as many people as possible to answer directly, even if they need significant accommodations and supports. For example, we explain that it's okay to have a supporter help the participant, including by reading or paraphrasing items, helping them remember details, or entering in the answers they have chosen. However, there's still situations where an autistic person cannot take part in a study directly, even with adapted instruments and lots of accommodations and supports. In those cases, it may be reasonable to collect information from informant reporters. It's important to remember, however, that informants cannot give you the same information. In other words, there's no such thing as truly a proxy reporter. Informant report is easier when asking about something that can be observed, but it still may not match a person's experience of what's causing behavior. Informant report is harder when you're asking the informant to try to guess a person's thoughts or experiences. In such cases, we've adapted items to make it clear it's what the informant thinks is true for the person. Plus, we've included additional items asking how confident the informant feels about the answers and how they know this information. You can sometimes triangulate by asking questions from both autistic and supporter pairs. But remember that this data may not generalize to autistic people who can't report directly at all, or to autistic people who are more isolated or independent. Again, I tried to cover a lot in this brief training. Please go to our website to find lots more concrete examples. In the meantime, I want to recap a few messages. Don't forget the need to balance protection with autonomy and justice. Qualitative data collection is possible, but it may take special effort to get rich data from a wide range of participants. There is far too much reliance on proxy reporting, but don't assume that, quote, validated instruments are validated for use with autistic participants. You may need to adapt instruments or create new ones, and then, of course, you need to retest them. And then, yes, community partners are integral to creating accessible consent and data collection materials and can really help projects be that much better. Again, I want to thank the full ASPIRE and AARP teams, our funders, and the AARP funders. Stay in touch. Thanks again.